Why? Like why? So earlier it was really interesting. We had a guy from the Post come in here earlier, and he was asking. The first thing he asked was, "Why do you have? What does the lockpicking room have to do with a hacking convention?" I'm like, that's first of all, that's not really what this is, but second of all, what does this have to do with computers? Is a greater question. Why do we do this? Because it's fun. We love it. It's something we do for its own sake. What does it have to do, however, with the computing world? What it has to do with the computing world is very, very straightforward. All of this wonderful, wonderful technology means nothing in the face of being stolen, right? So I can just take a serial cable, get into the server room, take a serial cable and get right in, get console, have fun. Same thing, the phone calls, the PBX system, I can get in there and tap all the wires if I get into that very cheeseball wafer lock that's pretending to guard it. Building a beautiful, lovely server room. Oh, doesn't that look pretty? Oh, it is lovely and gets undermined right at the hardware store. Now, this is why we do it. We love what we do. It's a lot of fun. It's picking for its own sake. I view it as a Rubik's Cube for the colorblind. Introduction to lockpicking. So before I actually get started, there's two rules that we follow. We do them for protection and safety and, common sense. And really, the basic rule is don't be dumb. Fundamentally, do not pick locks that you do not own. Now, none of these, all of these locks, obviously, you don't own any of the ones on the table. We do. We are giving them to you for your own purpose. No, not giving. We are laying them out on the table for y'all to pick. That is their purpose in life. Enjoy, have fun with them. On this topic, if you rent an apartment, you don't own that lock. You are actually renting that lock as well as the apartment contents that it protects. Speaking of protecting, do not pick locks that you rely on. It is really, really easy to whip a lock, what I call whip a lock, to basically render it useless. You can either render it so that it never locks again, or you can render it so that it never opens again. The process of picking, particularly the ones that we're going to show you here today, grind down the bottoms of the pins of the lock. Obviously, sooner or later, if you do too much of that, you're going to get that lock in a state where it can never open. It'll become clear. The specific reasons will become clear when we get finished. But you're going to realize this in about 2 slides. But every single, you cannot pick a lock with only one tool, right? So all the cute little TV and movie shows where somebody picks a bobby pin, maybe a bobby pin, or somebody picks up a nail off the ground and gets. None of that's possible. In fact, the only funny movie lockpicking that's even remotely plausible is when people take a paper clip and get out of a pair of handcuffs with it. That actually can work, but again, I'm terrified as to why you're nodding away in agreement. All right. Hello? Okay? All right, fine. Pin tumbler locks are the type of locks that we're going to be discussing today in particular. Obviously, there's many different kinds. There's magnetic locks, there's guarded, there's warded, there's all kinds of fun locks. We're going to be talking about the most common. The ones that you find on most doors, padlocks, and, doors. I don't know if you can see that. You might be able to. The lock itself, there's 3 main pieces that we're going to be discussing. We'll be discussing, we won't be discussing the lock sort of assembly itself. This is the cylinder of the lock, which is where all the actual locking takes place. And then in here is the pin, and if you look in the inside of a lock, you'll be able to see just the front of what are presumably 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 pins. Again, this is that same thing, but in cartoon form. If you look at it on the inside, that single pin that you're looking at, it's actually an entire stack. It's 2 pins, or maybe in some cases 3. The cylinder itself is there, and it's suspended. It's pushed down by a spring. We call this the key pin. We call that the driving pin. The way this thing works, obviously, the spring pushes everything down so that the driver pin is blocking the cylinder from turning. If you try to like stick a screwdriver in there, yeah, another piece of movie magic that's never going to happen. You stick a screwdriver in there and turn, all you get is you get that driver pin blocking the cylinder and nothing changes, right? Oh, that's the problem, keep hitting the wrong button. Sorry. If you use a key, all right, so presumably the key that is cut correctly, if the locksmith has cut your key right, will then push that key pin to where the gap in between the key and the driver pin hit that shear line, what we call the shear line, and the cylinder opens. Now, again, because the same reasons that a screwdriver won't work, there's not just one key stack, there's not just one pin stack. There's usually going to be 4 or 5. Our examples here, our slides are all for a 5-stack lock. Most of the padlocks that you have there are 4, some of the tinier ones are 3. You know, mileage may vary. As the key works, the way the key is cut, as you see these things, these driver pins are all of different sizes. And the key, if you use a key, all right, so presumably the key that is cut correctly, if the locksmith has cut your key right, will then push that key pin to where the gap in between the key and the driver pin hit that shear line, what we call the shear line, and the cylinder opens. Now, again, because the same reasons that a screwdriver won't work, there's not just one key stack, there's not just one pin stack. There's usually going to be 4 or 5. Our examples here, our slides are all for a 5-stack lock. Most of the padlocks that you have there are 4, some of the tinier ones are 3. You know, mileage may vary. As the key works, the way the key is cut, as you see these things, these driver pins are all of different sizes. And the keys correspond with the level that all of the pins at the same time land on the shear line, the lock turns. Just a side note, these points, they're meaningless, right, in terms of the actual key operation. They're valuable so that the key gets in and out of the lock, but beyond that, they have nothing to do with the way the actual lock turns. And you could, in theory, and our machine does this as well, cut this key so that these little lines are not there. If this key has been cut wrong and this bit is too low, then the driver pin will prevent the cylinder from turning. If it's cut too high, then the key pin itself will prevent the cylinder from turning. Now, the process that we're about to show you comes with an inherent question. And the inherent question is, why can this even work in the first place? How is it that I'm able to turn the bottom of the cylinder and start manipulating individual pins and have that make a difference? Aren't these pins all lined up perfectly? Why should that even work? And the answer, of course, is that in a perfect world they would, but manufacturing defects and the cost of the technology to get around those manufacturing defects is immense. So if you're going to spend like $1,000 on a lock, it's not going to be one of these cheeseball padlocks, right? It's going to be some heavy magnetic, ultra technological lock. These locks are manufactured for mass production, for mass consumption, and as such, they hold inherent vulnerabilities. And they're the machining defects, and where the worn down, like the machine will get worn down. It'll only have so much of a fault tolerance before, again, we start spending, an incredible amount of money in order to prevent those defects from occurring. These are what the driver pins look like. These are what the keyways, the pin holes themselves look like. And I don't know if you can see this. They're in the real world, so this is what it really looks like. These are slightly offset, if you can tell. And cleverly enough, I didn't put this PowerPoint together, I'm just discussing it, but I'm particularly impressed with the way they did this because this pin does correspond to that. This pin stack does correspond to that center pin stack. And if you'll notice, this fourth pin happens to be the one that's the farthest out to the right, clockwise. Most of these padlocks all turn clockwise. Most house door keys will open counterclockwise, but lock clockwise. Be that as it may. These examples are clockwise keys for the purposes of the example. So the way you set the binding pin, as you can see, if you have to, first thing you're going to want to do is to put just a little tiny bit of tension on the cylinder itself, turn it slightly, and then push the key pair up, the key stack up, to where the driver pin and the key pin, the gap between them hits the shear line and the cylinder opens. But wait! There's more than one pin stack! Yes, there are. So, in order to pull multiple pins, you need to start with the pin stack that is the farthest to the right, well, assuming you're going clockwise. You need to start with a pin stack that is the closest to the direction in which you are opening the lock. You'll be able to tell this because when you manipulate each individual pin, one of them will have slightly more resistance than the rest of them. Now, when I say slightly, I mean really slightly. Like your first time out doing this, you're probably not even going to notice. Like it takes a while to start recognizing what the difference is in between So as soon as I've gotten my first pin stack set, then I move on. Then by definition, another pin stack will be the binding pin, and I go after it and I attack that one. How do I know which one is the binding pin? You don't. That's what you're finding out by manipulating these pins individually. So I'll cut a little bit ahead, or I'll come back to this sentence frequently. And the sentence is, be gentle, be easy, relax. And overlifting is one of those aspects of brute force that's going to fail in the process of opening a lock. If I push this too far up, now my now my key pin is binding instead of the driver pin. So if I go too far, I'm not just trying to shove these pins up all the way up into the lock cylinder. It's not going to open that way. Other tools, so now we'll discuss what the tools are that you see on the tables around you. This is a rake. This, instead of necessarily lifting each type of individual pin, a tool like this is going to basically brute force probability. And you're going to just jump, make all the pins jump, and as kind of a random as order as possible, and it will open itself up. Turns out this is a good way to get started opening locks. This is a good way to get a feel for how the amount of tension and pressure that you need in order to turn a cylinder properly. It's at some points on locks that are being made, I think these are a good example. These master locks, the older ones, were all made really, really extra cheaply. The newer master locks are still made pretty much the same way, except except these driver pins are actually either spooled or threaded. So raking is a great way to introduce yourself to lockpicking, but after a certain level, it's not gonna do you any more good. You're gonna need to start learning how to manipulate the pins individually. And the way to, just briefly, again, because I have time and I'm gonna take it, the way to get around spooled or threaded pins is actually sort of to reverse pick it, where you're gonna actually push the pin up. This is actually a perfect example. You'll push the pin stack up too high intentionally and let it drop down slowly while you feel the tension and let that thing turn. Because if it's a spooled or a threaded pin, if you just push it up halfway, we don't have pictures, I wish I did, but if you can imagine it, it's easy for that cylinder to turn without you actually having the pin stack sitting where it needs to sit.